Maybe we should talk about sin first.
Yes,
I think
good
sin is
idea.
very different.
Okay.
So why does Jesus die in Orthodoxy? It's not as an atoning sacrifice for sin, not even a little bit. No, it's got nothing to do with sin. Would God be angry? But why wouldn't God forgive? He just does. There's no reason. He just does. But ultimately, you're on your own. No, so therefore, no assurance.
Yeah.
So there's no original sin in Orthodoxy. No
Right,
concept of original sin.
Yeah.
Speak of being saved by grace through faith. But it's the graces that you receive through the church and then have to add to with your own worthiness and spiritual progress. This might be a good point at which to talk about Mary.
Okay.
But tell us about the Catholic doctrine of Mary. Why is Mary so important and such a big deal in Orthodoxy? And this is one of those places, and there are many of these places, where there's doctrine on the one hand, and then there's the vibe of the people on the other that tells you really what the doctrine is without being able to explain it. Being kind of written into Mary is the monastic ideal of self-denial. Having achieved that herself, she convinces God to have compassion on humanity and convinces God to enact her plan of salvation.
We really need the scriptures to ground us, don't we? Because, the left unchecked, human institutions and our human wills and desires lead us to places that Jesus doesn't lead us. Well, I've picked a couple of topics: communion and the church. Your turn next. Where's
Okay,
this?
all right. There's so many. So we've kind of touched on assurance, haven't we? And I think we can say that's a definite. Okay, it's a definite similarity, though, but perhaps for different. Maybe we should talk about sin first.
Yes,
I think sin is very different.
Okay.
Because let me tell you why I wish I was Roman Catholic.
Okay.
And you ready?
Go for
Here it is. Here it is. Sin is still a problem in between me and God in Roman Catholicism, and
Absolutely.
okay, and it's a problem that has to be solved by someone or something.
Yes.
Whereas in Orthodoxy, that's not a problem. So why does Jesus die in Orthodoxy? It's not as an atoning sacrifice for sin, not even a little bit. No, so it's not even kind of Jesus is going to help you a little bit with sin to get you on your way, and you're left alone for the rest of it. No, it's got nothing to do with sin. The purpose of Jesus' death is that he will be raised again, that he will defeat death in Orthodoxy. Right. So God is not an angry policeman in the sky who wants to punish our transgressions. And one writer has said, God is like a loving father who says to you, don't go out without your jumper on, you will catch cold. Right. But we go out, we go and play with our friends, we don't take a jumper with us, we come back, we've caught a cold. Our loving father says, well, see, I told you, and I'm sorry that you hurt, you have a cold now, but why would that loving father be angry? That hasn't damaged the father. So why should God be angry with our sin? And one of their modern commentators says, well, why? Not only why does God would God be angry, but why wouldn't God forgive? He just does. There's no reason. He just does. So there's no need for a sacrifice for sin. What is needed is to overcome the consequences of sin, which is death, and Jesus dies to defeat death in order to help us over death. This is what's called Christus Victor. It is not an Orthodox doctrine, but it sounds similar, that Jesus dies in order to defeat death for us. But in Christus Victor, you've got some assurance. Well, okay, death is defeated on the basis of Jesus' death. Hooray. No, not in Orthodoxy. It's still only giving you a leg up, a bit of an aid to get you on your way to make spiritual progress, and therefore there can be no assurance because you're on your own, buddy. God's giving you some help, for sure. Come into the church and receive the graces of the sacraments to get some more help. We'll help each other, but ultimately you're on your own. No, so therefore no assurance.
Wow.
100. So sometimes I will speak to Roman Catholics and I'll pose the question: if you were to die tonight and come before God, would He let you into His heaven?
Yep.
And sometimes Catholics will say yes. Sometimes they will say yes because I have done certain things.
Yep.
But an Orthodox person always knows the answer is no.
Wow.
100% of Orthodox people will say no. I cannot, because to say I am certain of entering heaven would presume I am worthy, and I cannot know if I'm worthy.
Right. Wow. Wow. Catholic Church does have a sin of presumption, which counters against what Catholics perceive as the arrogance of a Roman Catholic saying, I'm going to heaven. Because in Roman Catholicism, ultimately, that depends on them and what they do. So they either think everyone's going to heaven, or they're not sure if they're good enough to get there. I did a survey of about 100 Roman Catholics during one of the Pope's visits to my city, Sydney, asking them those two very, very good questions. If you died tomorrow, would you... I hope sincerely you don't die tomorrow, but if you did, would you go to heaven? And 75% of the Roman Catholics said, I don't know, or no, and 25% said yes, I am confident I'm going to heaven. And then of the 25 that said yes, I'm going to heaven, a third said because and it would be a various list of good things that they'd done, or spiritual things that they'd done, like going to Mass every Sunday, or praying every day, or things of that nature. A third of them said because Jesus' death on the cross has paid for my sins, which is the Protestant answer. Anything that starts with I, Protestants argue from the Scriptures, is against what the Bible teaches. But anything that starts with Jesus is on the right track, just in case you're wondering the answer to that question. And a third of them said, it's just a vibe. I've just got this hunch that I'm going to heaven. I don't know why. I'm not exactly sure, but I'm sure that I am, because of this kind of vibe, in a sense, in a conviction. I think I'm going to heaven, which is interesting. Which leads back to, what does Roman Catholicism understand about sin? And the word that frequently gets used is the word macula, or spot. Now, John and I both share a medical background, so we both know about something called macular degeneration, which is spots on the back of the eyes that make it harder for older people to see. But the other time you hear the word macula used is in reference to Mary and the Immaculate Conception, which literally means that Mary was born without macula, or without sin. So she was conceived without, not born, conceived without the spot of sin. So I often describe a Roman Catholic approach to sin is you've got a copybook that's your life, and in that copybook is one really big black spot called original sin, and that makes relationship between you and God really difficult. In fact, they might even use the term that at that point people are dead in their sins, and the sacrament of baptism, the grace of baptism that comes through the Roman Catholic Church, removes that stain or that spot of sin and enables the Catholic to continue their journey towards heaven. And over time they will transgress God's laws, or the Church's laws, and incur further smaller macula or smaller spots, and by cooperating with the graces that they can receive through the sacramental system, like going to Mass gets rid of some of those little smudges, Going to confession, or what they now call the sacrament of reconciliation, enables you to get rid of some of those bigger stains. But you have to cooperate with that sacrament, and you have to do penance to pay off the temporal aspects of those sins, so that your copybook is in such a state that when you die, you're good enough to get into heaven. Trouble is, no one really knows how good you've got to be to get to heaven. So when you go to a Catholic funeral, and, you know, in the back of people's minds even today is, what's going to happen to this person now that they've died? The Catholic Church will emphasise it many times during the ceremony. If they are Roman Catholic, this person has been baptised. We think this person's going to heaven, not necessarily because they're a good bloke, although everyone will say they're a good bloke. That's what people do at funerals. But they will say, we think this person's going to heaven because they've been baptised. And those little spots will be either dealt with by the things that they've done in this life, or even the things that they do after they die before they get into heaven. And that whole concept of purgatory is part of a Roman Catholic theology of sin, that the temporal aspects, it's a cooperation between us and God in removing sin. So we've got to do our bit, God's done his bit, and if all of that works out okay, then a Roman Catholic will get to heaven. So a Roman Catholic can say, for instance, that I'm dead in my sin and I've been born again through the sacrament of baptism. Okay. They can also say that I've been saved by grace alone. And by that they mean the graces that come through the Catholic sacramental system, mediated by the Catholic priests, to deal with these spots that they have in order for them to be good enough for heaven. Luther described it as a theology of glory, going from good to better, okay, as those spots gradually get removed over time. One of the things that Roman Catholicism does need to wrestle with is a guy called Pelagius in the 5th century, a British monk, who argued with Augustine about whether we deserve to get to heaven. And Augustine argued very, very strongly that no, it's only by God's unmerited favour, by grace alone, that people can go to heaven. So the way that that is understood in Roman Catholicism is you need the sacrament of baptism in order to remove original sin, so that you can start cooperating with the sacramental system in order to get to heaven. So a lot of similarities, a few practical differences.
Oh, there's definitely a lot of similarities there, but again, what lies behind it is very different. So there's no original sin in Orthodoxy, no concept of original sin. But baptism is the way you enter into, you become a member of the church, and therefore the ark of salvation. So that's the way in. And yes, you reminded me that indeed Orthodox people will speak of being saved by grace through faith. Of course we have grace. Of course it's by faith. Of course it is. But it's the graces that you receive through the church and then have to add to with your own worthiness and spiritual progress.
Right. Wow.
And because of that conception of sin as being certainly something that is damaging to us, but not between us and God. There is no everything you described there, which sounded very mathematical from an Orthodox perspective. Here's the sins, and here's my penances, and I've got to try and make up to it. Nothing like that in Orthodoxy. And no need, therefore, for purgatory. But nevertheless, when you end your life and you are still far away from God, how do we solve that problem of making ourselves worthy for God? Let's invent something I wonder if the person, people who thought of purgatory invented this one too. And in Orthodoxy, there's something called toll houses. So you make your journey between after death, between this life and God, through various toll houses. And like a toll house, there's someone there to collect the toll. And who is collecting the toll? It's devils and demons who come and test you as to your spiritual worthiness, not because of your sin necessarily, but your spiritual worthiness. Did you pray enough? Did you discipline yourself enough? Were you worthy of God? And so people have conceived of various levels of testing in order to make yourself worthy to get to God, which sounds very much like purgatory to me. Now, to be fair, this is not official Orthodox doctrine. This is not canonical, but it makes logical sense because how do you get from this level of unworthiness to be worthy? So that's the purgatory-like solution within Orthodoxy.
Fascinating.
This might be a good point at which to talk about Mary.
Okay, good.
Because this is going to be kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Why don't you head us off? And I think the Catholic doctrine is better known, and indeed I know the Catholic doctrine better than the Orthodox doctrine, for reasons that are going to become apparent in a moment. But tell us about the Catholic doctrine of Mary.
Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that very early on in church history, people were elevating Mary to a position beyond any other human being. So you've got some Gnostic Gospels that start to talk about worshipping Mary. You've got prayers in the 1st and 2nd century to Mary for various needs and requirements. You've got the virginity of Mary kind of elevating her above the rest of the kind of muddied material world surrounding them, and the elevation of virginity as a source of higher holiness than kind of carnal life occurring within the first few hundred years of the Christian Church. Even the Nicene Creed, born of the Virgin Mary, was seen to be important enough to mention in that creed. So despite the scriptures being relatively silent on the place of Mary, particularly silent on the idea that she is elevated above other people. Now you might argue Luke 1, grace to you, O highly graced one, as the archangel Gabriel speaks to her, gives her a different status. But you've got Mark's Gospel, where Mary kind of thinks Jesus is mad and tries to keep him quiet. You've even got in Luke's Gospel Mary's own words crying out to Jesus as her saviour. But very early on in the early church, Mary gets kind of elevated beyond any other human being. So Council of Ephesus is a key point where, again, they're trying to defend now the humanity of Jesus. So Nicaea, they're arguing for the divinity of Jesus, that he is fully God. Now, where do Jesus' natures kind of come into play, and how can we think of Jesus as fully human? Well, Mary is the mother of God, so every human being has to have a human mother. Jesus, who's fully God, we've accepted that, is fully human because Mary is the mother of God. So that's defending Jesus' human nature. it still gets kind of wrestled with, and John Chrysostom's one of the key thinkers in this space and time, wrestling with the relationship between the natures of Christ, his divine nature and his human nature. And in Chalcedon, it's articulated clearly that the two natures, Jesus fully human, fully God, and the two natures don't subsume or undermine the other. His humanity doesn't diminish his divinity doesn't diminish his humanity in any way, which is classical Christian Christology. But when you've got Mary elevated already to a kind of superhuman level, and Jesus has got to be better than Mary, so his humanity is even beyond that of Mary, you get this trajectory in Roman Catholicism of diminishing Jesus' humanity, pushing him into the divine realm, and as we talked about a bit earlier on, diminishing the necessity and importance of his work on the cross to pay for our sins, and even diminishing sin itself. So Mary is tied up with this whole distancing Jesus, distancing God, underplaying our carnal humanity in Roman Catholicism. And it kind of continues on with other attributes that are given to Mary, particularly articulated in the the 1850s and 1950s, when a couple of other key Marian dogmas get added to Mary. Her Immaculate conception, that she now, being superhuman, was conceived without sin. It's not that she didn't ever sin, she didn't in Roman Catholicism, but her conception, her carnal conception by her parents, was also free of any of the corruption of sin. So she's elevated further again. And then 100 years later, because she was conceived without sin and never sinned, well, she didn't bodily die, because the consequences of sin are death and God's judgment. Mary escapes that judgment, so she was assumed into heaven bodily. Again, kind of taking on almost divine attributes rather than recognising and affirming, and perhaps even, as the scriptures put her, as a hero of faith, someone who, given all the same carnal stuff that we experience, kept trusting Jesus. Roman Catholicism robs Catholics of that by elevating Mary into this superhuman state, and indeed I think also distorts the Trinity, because she is so elevated that her divine attributes actually start to rival those of the Holy Spirit and actually distort the shape of the Trinity, kind of giving it a sense of equiternity, that there are four divine beings, Father, or divine persons, Father, Son, Spirit, and almost Mary. And the things that Jesus does are attributed to Mary, so, often thought of very closely together, both in an understanding of Jesus, but also the worship of Jesus is often very closely tied to the hyper-veneration of Mary in Roman Catholics. So I think that gives you a bit of a sense of how Mary functions in Roman Catholicism.
Well, it's something, the place of Mary is, and I think that's very understandable, everything you've just said there. And that to me, I grasp and I go, yes, great, I understand now. But I've always struggled as trying to understand why in Orthodoxy there's such a devotion to Mary. So I get some of those things. It's Mary's the mother, and we love our mothers, and therefore she has particular influence over Jesus. Okay, I'll pray to Mary. But to me, there always seemed to be, there was a lot more going on there. in the thinking, and I couldn't quite pin down why is Mary so important and such a big deal in Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And this is one of those places, and there are many of these places, where there's doctrine on the one hand, and then there's the vibe of the people on the other that tells you really what the doctrine is without being able to explain it. Yeah. So as a cradle Orthodox, I knew Mary was important. I didn't know why.
Yeah.
So only recently have I come across a fellow by the name of Gregory Palamas, or when I say him, other people writing about him and then looking at him. So I didn't discover him. He's a 14th century theologian, and he may not have thought of this himself. He may have been collecting together thoughts of others previously, but he gives a complete story of Mary and her life and her role and why she's important. Now, his conception, Mary is presented to the temple by her parents, Joseph and Anna, at the age of 3. On arrival to the temple, there are some women who accompany Mary into the Holy of Holies. So let's think about what's going on here. The Holy of Holies, where the male priests get to enter, the high priest gets to enter once a year for the sacrifice of atonement. No problem. 3-year-old Mary gets to go in. She lives there until the time she marries or is betrothed to Joseph and leaves to bear Jesus. In that interim period, she is fed through the curtain. She's given food as required, but she, even though she's fed, she fasts. She empties herself of all knowledge and things. So being kind of written into Mary is the monastic ideal of self-denial. She purifies herself. She prays ceaselessly, and so purifies herself and elevates herself through self-denial that she glimpses and comes into communion with God. And having made herself, having achieved the pinnacle of what Orthodoxy is all about, which is deification, which is becoming, having achieved that herself and become worthy of God, she therefore has influence over God. And so she convinces God to have compassion on humanity. And it gets worse. And convinces God to enact her plan of salvation. It's her plan of salvation. And her plan of salvation involves Jesus being born within her, so it's her plan. And therefore salvation is her. We have to thank her for salvation.
It's her will.
It's her will, and it's her plan that it comes about. Now, progressing on from that, she then becomes the pinnacle of creation. So she is the deified one, the one who's become God. It's she who effectively is the second Adam, not Jesus. And she is also the fulfillment of all the Old Testament promises of God, not Jesus. So a lot of the Old Testament is allegorized within Orthodoxy. So the burning bush, what does that speak of? It's Mary. The Ark of the Covenant, what does that speak of? Mary. So it all becomes, it's all about Mary.
There's lots of that in Roman Catholicism as well.
And one of the modern commentators, and I'm struggling to remember, I think it was Florovsky, a Russian Orthodox priest, I believe, who said something to the effect of all grace and all favour, that it can only come through Mary. Nothing else comes except through her. And so she is conceived as, and you'll be familiar with this kind of idea, she is the compassionate one who can twist Jesus' arm behind his back and convince him that someone is worth forgiving. But Jesus, he gets upset with people, he runs out of patience, he doesn't have time time for sinners, Mary does. So go to Mary first, and she will get you the forgiveness, and not just forgiveness, but all other spiritual favours that you desire. Catholicism, she doesn't die. In Orthodoxy, she does die. She goes to sleep. Sleep. So she dies and is transported to heaven bodily. So I'm not sure if she needs a resurrection body, but she it's the dormition of Mary is the doctrine.
Right.
So she does die, but nevertheless, by all accounts and purposes, she is the co-redemptrix. Not in so many words, because they don't have that category in Orthodoxy, but effectively, she is the mediator of salvation for all humanity.
Wow. It's fascinating, isn't it? Because Christians from early days have elevated Mary into these sorts of positions, and we really need the scriptures to ground us, don't we? Because the left unchecked, our human institutions and our human wills and desires lead us to places that Jesus doesn't lead us.
And I think one of the things that I've heard you say, and I think it captures it so well, is that what's that kind of doctrine of Mary does is it dehumanizes Jesus. It takes away his humanity and places it all upon Mary, which is so disrespectful, and that's a mild way of putting it. It's blasphemous, really, to suggest that Jesus does not have compassion, that he doesn't care about saving humanity, that he doesn't sympathise with us as the scriptures tell us.
Which might be a good place for us to land if we're looking for a landing point, John, and that is that the Christian doctrine that was particularly emphasised and recaptured at the time of the Reformation is the full divinity, the full humanity of Jesus Christ communicated to us through the scriptures as the ultimate authority, and the importance of the doctrine of justification as the pinnacle of Jesus's life, death and mission, dying on the cross for us as a man who is God, who can unite us to God directly, wholly and completely as human beings, who are human beings, who always remain human beings, but dealing completely with the barrier of sin so that we can have assurance of salvation, relationship with the Father into eternity as his perfected human creation.
And what a relief. Why would you give that up?
Yes.
Well, I've spoken to people and it's a phenomenon in both of our fields that people are converting to Catholicism and to Orthodoxy. And I've spoken to people who are converting to Orthodoxy, and I challenge them and I say, so do you understand that there's no certainty of salvation, no assurance of salvation in Orthodoxy? And are you happy to give that up in order to be Orthodox? And they say yes. And that I cannot comprehend. Why would you abandon the thing that is the most important thing ever to know? Not because you've got pride or an active imagination, but God has promised through his Son salvation. Why would you give that up?
The certainty of your relationship with your loving Creator Father. How could you have anything less than that? And live with anything less
you could have the whole world, and it wouldn't be worth.
That's right. Yep. A pearl of immeasurable treasure.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Well, John, I'd love to continue this conversation, because I feel like on a number of things we've just touched the tip of the iceberg. So maybe we should arrange a follow-up chat, and perhaps if people have got questions about what we've been talking about, or if they feel that we've got this wrong and we need to correct the way that we've presented Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, they could comment on that, and we could get together and tease out some of the similarities and differences of Roman Catholicism and Greek Orthodoxy again.
Yes, terrific.
All right.
Thanks very much for your time. It's been great.
It's been a pleasure, John, and God bless you and your work, mate. All right.